Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In the last episode, it was sad because Brian Epstein died. The Beatles have been trying to find life without drugs, and they became involved with the Maharishi for enlightenment. So today we're going to see what happens next. When Brian died, the Beatles found out a lot of things. They were being taxed at a 96% rate, which sounds really bad, and the flotation of Northern songs had given John and Paul some untaxed income. Ringo and George, who weren't writing songs, were poor in comparison, and everyone had spent money beyond their means. June of 1967, they had spent approximately £750,000 on homes, cars, and luxury living. The advice the tax experts gave them was to invest in related businesses with practical real estate value and then go public in 4 or 5 years. So this was a solid long-term plan to ensure the Beatles' wealth as they got older. The Beatles felt like business was like school. They asked Peter, why couldn't business be fun? Why couldn't it be something pretty like Apple? So that's how Apple Corporation came to be. Peter would be the administrative director of Apple, plus operate and run Apple Company. And Neil Aspinall was named a managing director of Apple Corporation. And Apple Corporation, in turn, purchased 80% of the stock of the old company. It was a partnership that all the Beatles signed, although John said later he was so stoned he didn't remember signing any papers. To get a tax break from investing, what was invested had to be a related field. The first idea was to open a chain of record stores, not so much to sell records, but to buy up valuable real estate for each store. Selling records was too commercial for the Beatles. The idea mushroomed and Apple became bigger than life, just like the Beatles were. The Beatles, they had Magic Alex and the Fool to hire. Alex would be given a workshop to research and develop his inventions, and the Fool could design and manufacture clothing on a mass level and sell it in their own store. The Fool's previous experience was an Amsterdam barbershop that they converted to a boutique. It went bankrupt because the Fool's personal expenses ran so high. The Beatles found out that the accountants had purchased the buildings for them. It was a long-term investment, a building on the corner of Baker and Paddington Streets. It was off the beaten path of shoppers. The boutique opened on December the 7th, 1967. George and John were the only ones to show up. Alex had hung no magic lighting on the street. It was too complicated. The lighting in the store was expensive, but not very unusual. And the press and the public wandered around the store. They were confused about what it was all about. The store had trinkets that was found in any head shop, and the clothing wasn't that great. There were huge dressing rooms which were good to shoplift in, and the day the shop opened, it started losing money. The Beatles weren't intimidated by all of that, though. February 1968, just when Apple was going full swing, the Beatles said that they wanted to finish their transcendental meditation course that they had started in Wales. This time, though, instead of a 10-day course, they were going to go to Rishikesh in the remote wilderness of North India for 3 months of serious study. They thought it would help them to run Apple, and they would live there without drugs or alcohol. The Beatles believed in the Maharishi and went to see him while he was in London. George and John became vegetarians, and John, though, had gone back to drugs after Brian's death. In the film part of their business, they were thinking about making a movie about the Maharishi. The proceeds would fund a transcendental meditation university in London. Peter wasn't too sure about the Maharishi. He thought he was using the Beatles' name for his own personal gain. The Maharishi had been trying to get a TV special, and he promised he would get the Beatles on the show. ABC lawyers called to verify, and Peter said the Beatles had no intention of going on the special. The Maharishi didn't give up and kept telling the show's lawyers he would get the Beatles. Peter ended up flying to the Maharishi to tell him face to face. Peter said that the Maharishi giggled and nodded when he was told him. The Maharishi still told the lawyers the Beatles would be in the show, and Peter had to fly out to Sweden, this time with Paul and George with him. They told him not to use their names to exploit his business affairs and that they would not appear on the special. The Maharishi just nodded and giggled once more. George said on the plane ride home, he just doesn't understand these things. February the 16th, they went to India. It was a remote area. and for the first time the Beatles were cut off from the world. Somehow, though, the world knew they were going to India, and everyone was waiting to hear what they had to say once they finished their lessons. The Beatles were joined by the Beach Boy Mike Love, jazz musician Paul Horn, Mia Farrow and her sister Tia, and her brother John, and some 20 other students who weren't famous. The ashram was more like a hotel than a Spartan guru camp. The sleeping quarters were complex stone bungalows with 4 or 5 bedrooms in each. The Beatles' rooms have 4 poster beds and solid English furniture. Each was equipped with a modern bath and toilet, and there was even electric fire for cold nights. Meals were eaten all together at long hand-carved tables under a vine-covered trellis next to the Ganges River, and the food was served by a large staff of servants and prepared in a modern kitchen by a trained chef. The Maharishi's house was a short distance from the compound. It was a modern building with its own kitchen and staff, and there was a woman to give the girls a daily massage. And the Maharishi was able to come and go in a helicopter with a launch pad. Peter said that this was the man who George had excused as not being a modern man. Once they settled in, they began to study. They got up at dawn, had an early breakfast. They went to long lectures and spent afternoons in meditation sessions. And there was a competition among them to see who could meditate the longest, and debates about who was getting it and who wasn't. John seemed to be really into it. Others felt that he was faking it and that George was the most spiritual of the group. They dressed in traditional Indian clothing and they let their hair grow, and they got to bathe in the Ganges River. After dinner, the Beatles would take out their guitars and under the moonlight would sing and write songs. 30 of the songs would be on their next album. Everyone was inspired. Donovan wrote Jennifer Jupiter for Patty Harrison's sister Ginny, and George turned 24 there, and the Maharishi presented him with a 7-pound cake and a fireworks display. Cynthia, she was stunned when John had arranged for them to sleep in separate quarters. John explained it would be good for meditating, and they would still see each other at the camp. Cynthia, beside that issue, loved being there. It was the last hope for her marriage. John was like a visitor in their home, and when he was there, he had drug dealers and other shady people with him. It was at this time that Cynthia started to find out about Yoko. She seemed to be everywhere, and Cynthia was glad to be away from her and the other shady people that John hanged around with. He wanted Yoko to go with him to India. He thought it would have been more fun. He didn't feel guilty about his relationship with Yoko because it was an intellectual one at that time. She was smart and opinionated, and Cynthia was too kind. Cynthia, when she was there in India, started to find herself. She meditated and started to paint and draw again, and she saw that John was getting healthier and stronger without drugs. Julian was celebrating his 5th birthday back home, and the Maharishi had a wardrobe made for Julian. John and Cynthia were moved by the Maharishi's thoughtfulness. They held hands while strolling the Ganges, and John said, "Oh, Sin, wouldn't it be wonderful to be together with Julian again? Everything will be fantastic again, won't it? I can't wait, Sin. Can you?" I guess that feeling passed, and John started to grow distant again. He stayed locked in his room, and Cynthia thought he was meditating, but he wasn't. He was writing long letters to Yoko. He got up early each morning and went to the mail drop to collect letters from her, and she wrote him faithfully. And she wrote him, "Look up at the sky, and when you see a cloud, think of me." John said he got excited by her letters, and he started to think of her as a woman, not just an intellectual woman. After 10 days, Ringo and Maureen bailed. Ringo used the excuse of having a delicate stomach, but they hated the ashram. Maureen didn't like the flying insects either. And when Ringo got back into London, Ringo told friends that the 10 days he spent in the ashram weren't as much fun as Butlin's holiday camp. Paul and Jane lasted 6 weeks. Paul wasn't getting it or believing it. The Maharishi's mock seriousness and the meditation felt too much like school for him. Paul and Jane were too sophisticated for the mystical gibberish. They didn't say that to the press. They just said they missed London and wanted to get home. John and George remained true believers. Neil Aspinall was skeptical. He was flying in and out of India, keeping the Beatles informed of the progress of Apple. Neil was to speak to the Maharishi for a film about him. He thought he would have a hard time explaining the business to him, but the Maharishi had a full-time accountant. Neil and the guru haggled over the points of agreement. and Neil realized that this guy knew more about making deals than he did. He's really into scoring the Maharishi. Magic Alex didn't believe in him either when he got there and saw the four-poster beds and the masseuses and the servants in the houses with the facilities. And the Maharishi had an accountant, and he said, "I never saw a holy man with a bookkeeper." Alex said that the sweet old women at the ashram were mentally ill Swedish old ladies who left their money to the Maharishi. Alex noticed that John was under the Maharishi's control. He was the healthiest he had been in years, but he felt like the guru was getting more than he was giving. When Alex had been there 7 days, he heard that the Maharishi wanted the Beatles to tithe 10 to 25% of their annual income to a Swiss account in his name. By the 10th week, Alex was trying to undermine the Maharishi. He smuggled wine into the compound, and he got it from a local village. And the men wouldn't drink, but the girls did. Someone said that the Maharishi had been fed chicken for dinner while he was trying to get everyone to be vegetarian. Everyone was willing to look the other way about that information, but the nurse who had provided the news came up with more startling news. She said to Alex that she had been fed chicken during one of her private consultations and that the Maharishi had made sexual advances to her. Alex relayed the message to the other women that were there, and they were horrified. Cynthia, she didn't believe Alex because he was jealous of anyone who had John's attention. Cynthia had seen the nurse in Alex's room at a candlelight table one night. And John, George, and Alex sat up arguing about it. George didn't believe it and was mad at Alex. And John, he had doubts. The Maharishi had turned out to be as worldly and mercenary as the rest. John decided to leave early the next morning. After breakfast, the Maharishi entered the compound and sat cross-legged under a grass canopy. The three men went to see him, and John told him, "We're leaving." And the Maharishi asked why, and John didn't have the courage to confront him. He just said, "You're the cosmic one. You should know." So Alex was afraid the Maharishi would try to block their passage home, and he was right. The Maharishi put the word out that the Beatles were not to be assisted in leaving. The townspeople told Alex that the Maharishi would put some sort of jinx on them if they helped. Alex was finally able to rent 2 old cars, and they piled their things in them and left. The cars kept breaking down every few miles, and John and Cynthia's car got a flat. There wasn't a spare tire, and Patty and George went ahead to get help. John and Cynthia and their driver sat alongside a deserted road in the heat for more than 3 hours before 2 Eastern educated travelers recognized John and gave them a lift. They were tired and mad when they got to Delhi, and they checked into the Hilton and were recognized. They didn't tell the press the reason for leaving. They just said that they had pressing business in London and didn't wish to be in a film the Maharishi was planning to shoot. When they got back to London, the Beatles kept silent about the ordeal. Years later, details got distorted, one being that Mia Farrow was the Maharishi's correspondent, not the nurse. So the reactions to it all was as follows. Ringo was benign. Paul was smug, like I told you so. George remained a believer and a follower. George felt that Alex was lying and tried to slander the Maharishi to get John away from him. John, he felt duped, he felt used, and he wrote in anger the song Sexy Sadie about the Maharishi. So I'm going to stop the video here. The Beatles decided to open their own company to make some money because of how much they were being taxed. Things started to go wrong from the beginning. The Beatles thought the Maharishi had all the answers to a life of peace and tranquility without drugs. They found out he was just a man like they were. The only one who kept believing him was George. We are more than halfway through the book, and we know what's going to happen, but we're going to see what Peter has to say about it. So I look forward to finding out more. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. Tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you.